In 1812, the small village of Schwarzenberg, nestled deep within the Bavarian forest near the border with Bohemia, was a place where ancient traditions still held sway over daily life. The dense woodlands that surrounded this remote settlement had witnessed countless generations come and go, their stories fading into whispers carried by the wind through towering pines and ancient oaks. Among the 43 families that called Schwarzenberg home, few commanded as much respect and fear as the Hartmanns, a family whose roots in the region stretched back over 2 centuries. Klaus Hartmann, a woodcutter of considerable skill and equally considerable temper, had built his reputation on his ability to navigate the treacherous paths that wound through the darkest corners of the forest. His wife, Margareta, was known throughout the village for her expertise in traditional remedies and her unsettling ability to predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Together, they lived in a modest, timber-framed house on the outskirts of Schwarzenberg, where the last cobblestone street gave way to dirt paths that disappeared into the wilderness. The winter of 1812 had been particularly harsh, even by the standards of those accustomed to the cruel Bavarian cold. Snow had begun falling in October and showed no signs of relenting as the year drew to its close. Food stores throughout the village had dwindled to dangerously low levels, and the weekly market that once bustled with merchants from neighboring towns had been reduced to a handful of desperate vendors selling turnips and stale bread at prices that few could afford. It was against this backdrop of desperation that the first disturbing reports began to surface. On a particularly bitter December morning, when the thermometer had plummeted well below freezing for the 7th consecutive day, Heinrich Bachmann, the village constable, received an unusual visit from Frau Weber, an elderly widow who lived alone in a cottage near the forest's edge. Her weathered hands trembled as she described strange sounds emanating from the woods during the previous 3 nights, sounds that she claimed were unlike anything she had heard in her 67 years of life in Schwarzenberg. According to Frau Weber's account, the sounds began each night around midnight, starting as a low humming that gradually transformed into what she could only describe as singing. The melody, she insisted, was hauntingly beautiful, yet deeply unsettling, carrying words in a language that seemed familiar, yet foreign at the same time. More disturbing still was her claim that the singing appeared to be moving through the forest, drawing closer to the village with each passing night. Heinrich Bachmann, a pragmatic man who had served as constable for nearly 20 years, initially dismissed Frau Weber's concerns as the product of an elderly mind under the strain of isolation and hunger. However, his skepticism began to waver when 2 other residents independently reported similar experiences. Jakob Müller, a baker whose shop stood on the main street, claimed to have heard the same mysterious singing while working his early morning shifts. Even more concerning was the testimony of Father Albrecht, the village priest, who admitted to being awakened by what he described as an otherworldly melody that seemed to penetrate the very walls of the church rectory. The singing, however, was only the beginning of what would become a winter of inexplicable events that would forever change the peaceful village of Schwarzenberg. As December progressed, and the snow continued to accumulate in drifts that reached the windows of first-floor rooms, other strange occurrences began to manifest with increasing frequency. Livestock throughout the village began exhibiting unusual behavior patterns that defied explanation. Cattle that had previously been docile became agitated and aggressive, refusing to enter their barns, and instead huddling together in the furthest corners of their enclosures. The village's small population of pigs, normally eager for their daily feeding, began rejecting food entirely, growing thin and sickly despite the efforts of their owners to coax them to eat. Most disturbing of all was the behavior of the dogs. traditionally reliable guardians who had always served as early warning systems against wolves and other forest predators. Without exception, every dog in Schwarzenberg began howling in unison each night at precisely midnight, their mournful cries echoing through the snow-covered streets for exactly 1 hour before falling silent as suddenly as they had begun. The village's children, usually resilient in the face of harsh winter conditions, also began displaying troubling symptoms that their parents struggled to understand. Previously healthy youngsters complained of recurring nightmares featuring a woman in white who beckoned to them from the forest's depths. Sleep became elusive for many families as their children woke screaming night after night, describing dreams so vivid and terrifying that even hardened adults found themselves glancing nervously toward their windows when darkness fell. It was during this atmosphere of mounting tension and inexplicable events that the Hartmann family's domestic situation began to deteriorate rapidly. Klaus Hartmann's woodcutting business, already struggling due to the severe weather conditions that made forest travel dangerous, came to a complete halt when several of his regular customers reported finding strange symbols carved into the trees he had marked for cutting. These symbols, described as a series of interconnected circles and lines that seemed to form no recognizable pattern, appeared overnight on trees that had shown no such markings the previous day. The discovery of these symbols marked the beginning of Klaus Hartmann's descent into behavior that his neighbors found increasingly erratic and disturbing. Previously known for his methodical approach to work and his adherence to village traditions, Klaus began venturing into parts of the forest that even experienced woodsmen avoided, particularly the dense grove known locally as the Hexenwald, or Witch's Wood, where local folklore claimed that evil spirits held dominion over both the living and the dead. Margarete Hartmann, meanwhile, began receiving visitors at all hours of the day and night, individuals who arrived at the family's isolated cottage under cover of darkness and departed before dawn. These nocturnal guests, according to accounts from other villagers who happened to observe their comings and goings, included people from neighboring villages who had traveled considerable distances through dangerous winter conditions for reasons that remained mysterious and unsettling. The transformation of the Hartmann household became even more pronounced when neighbors began noticing that smoke emerged from their chimney at unusual hours, often accompanied by smells that bore no resemblance to ordinary wood fires. These odors, described variously as sickly sweet and overwhelmingly pungent, would drift across the village on still nights, causing mothers to hurry their children indoors and men to check the locks on their doors with unusual frequency. As the winter of 1812 deepened and showed no signs of abating, the strange occurrences in Schwarzenberg began to follow a more predictable pattern that only served to heighten the villagers' sense of dread and anticipation. The nightly singing from the forest became a regular feature of village life, though its source remained as mysterious as ever. Father Albrecht, in his capacity as the village's spiritual leader, organized prayer vigils intended to ward off whatever malevolent forces might be responsible for the disturbing events. But even these gatherings were disrupted by unexplained phenomena that tested the faith of even the most devout parishioners. During one particularly memorable prayer service held on the feast of St. Nicholas, attendees reported that the candles within the church began flickering in unison, despite the absence of any detectable wind or draught. More unsettling still was the unanimous observation that the temperature within the church seemed to drop dramatically whenever Father Albrecht attempted to recite specific prayers, particularly those invoking protection against evil spirits and supernatural influences. The villagers' attempts to understand and combat the strange events plaguing their community led to increased scrutiny of the Hartmann family, whose isolation and increasingly odd behavior made them natural subjects of suspicion and gossip. Klaus Hartmann's abandonment of his traditional wood-cutting routes in favor of secretive expeditions into the deepest and most dangerous parts of the forest provided ample material for speculation among his neighbors, who began to question whether his activities might be connected to the village's recent troubles. These suspicions were further fueled by observations of Margaret Hartmann's behavior, which had become noticeably more reclusive and secretive as the winter progressed. Previously active in village affairs and known for her participation in communal activities such as harvest celebrations and religious festivals, she now avoided contact with other residents entirely, venturing from her cottage only during the darkest hours of night and returning before dawn with bundles and packages whose contents remained a mystery to all who observed her comings and goings. The Hartmann family's apparent prosperity during a time of widespread hardship and deprivation also contributed to growing suspicions about their activities and methods. While other families in Schwarzenberg struggled to obtain adequate food and fuel for their homes, the Hartmanns seemed to have access to resources that were unavailable to their neighbors. Smoke rose from their chimney constantly, suggesting an abundant supply of fuel, and the occasional glimpses of their evening meals, visible through their cottage windows, revealed quantities and varieties of food that were impossible to obtain through conventional means in the village's current circumstances. Perhaps most disturbing to the villagers was the increasing frequency with which children reported seeing figures moving through the forest during daylight hours, figures that matched descriptions of the Hartmann couple, but appeared to be engaged in activities that no responsible adult would pursue in the dangerous conditions that prevailed throughout the winter months. These sightings, initially dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations stimulated by fear and uncertainty, became more frequent and detailed as the weeks passed, with some children providing descriptions of specific actions and behaviors that were too consistent and elaborate to be purely fictional. The children's accounts described a systematic pattern of activity that suggested the Hartmanns were not simply gathering firewood or hunting for food, as might be expected during such harsh conditions. Instead, witnesses reported observing them engaged in what appeared to be the construction of structures deep within the forest, using materials that they transported from their cottage during their nocturnal expeditions. The purpose of these alleged construction projects remained unclear, but their location in some of the most remote and inaccessible parts of the woodland suggested intentions that went far beyond ordinary survival activities. As winter tightened its grip on Schwarzenberg and the calendar moved inexorably toward the darkest days of the year, the villagers' concerns about the Hartmann family's activities reached a crescendo that would ultimately lead to events far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The systematic pattern of strange occurrences that had plagued the village for months began to intensify and focus with a precision that suggested deliberate orchestration rather than random supernatural activity. The nightly singing from the forest, which had initially seemed to wander aimlessly through the trees, began originating from increasingly specific locations that corresponded with areas where children had reported seeing the Hartmanns during their daytime expeditions. This correlation became so pronounced that Heinrich Bachmann, the village constable, began plotting the reported locations on a hand-drawn map that revealed a disturbing pattern emerging from what had previously seemed like random events. The map showed that the sources of the mysterious singing were gradually forming a circle around the village, with each night's performance moving clockwise to the next position in what appeared to be a carefully planned sequence. This realization prompted Bachmann to organize a group of volunteers to investigate the forest areas where the singing had been most recently detected. But these expeditions consistently failed to yield any concrete evidence of the source of the mysterious sounds. More troubling still were the reports from villagers who claimed to have witnessed lights moving through the forest during the hours when the singing was most active. These lights, described as an unusual shade of orange that seemed to pulse and flicker in rhythm with the mysterious melodies, appeared to be deliberately guided rather than naturally occurring phenomena such as swamp gas or atmospheric disturbances. The combination of singing, lights, and the Heartman's increasingly secretive behavior created an atmosphere of dread and anticipation that permeated every aspect of village life. Families began barricading their doors and windows each evening, and parents instituted strict curfews that kept children indoors from sunset to sunrise. The village's normal social activities, already curtailed by the harsh winter conditions, ceased entirely as residents retreated into their homes and waited for whatever was building toward its inevitable culmination. It was during this period of heightened tension that the first direct encounter between villagers and the mysterious phenomena occurred, an event that would provide crucial insights into the true nature of the threat facing Schwarzenberg, while simultaneously raising questions that would haunt the community for generations to come. On the night of December 19th, 17-year-old Anna Zimmermann, daughter of the village blacksmith, disappeared from her family's cottage under circumstances that defied logical explanation. Anna, known throughout Schwarzenberg for her responsible nature and strict adherence to her parents' rules, had never given her family cause for concern or worry. Her disappearance was discovered when her mother went to wake her for the early morning chores that were part of her daily routine, only to find Anna's bed empty and showing no signs that it had been occupied during the night. The investigation into Anna's disappearance revealed details that deeply disturbed both her family and the village authorities. Her bedroom window, which her father insisted had been securely latched before the family retired for the evening, was found standing open despite the bitter cold that had frozen the latch mechanism solid. More puzzling still was the discovery of footprints in the snow outside the window, footprints that led away from the cottage in a straight line toward the forest, but showed no corresponding tracks leading to the house. The footprints themselves presented another mystery that defied conventional explanation. While their size and shape clearly matched Anna's feet, they appeared to have been made by someone walking barefoot through snow that was more than a foot deep. Yet the impressions showed no signs of the disturbance or distress that would be expected from someone traversing such conditions without proper footwear. The depth and clarity of the prints suggested that they had been made by someone walking calmly and deliberately, as if the sub-freezing temperatures and treacherous conditions posed no discomfort or danger. Heinrich Bachmann organized search parties that scoured the forest throughout the day following Anna's disappearance, but the expeditions failed to locate any trace of the missing girl, despite covering extensive areas of woodland and following the footprint trail for more than 3 miles before it disappeared at the edge of a frozen stream. The search efforts were hampered by fresh snowfall that began in the early afternoon and continued throughout the night, obscuring any additional evidence that might have provided clues to Anna's whereabouts or the circumstances of her disappearance. The failure to locate Anna Zimmermann cast a pall of fear and helplessness over Schwarzenberg that was unlike anything the village had previously experienced. Parents began sleeping in their children's rooms, and families organized night watches to ensure that no additional disappearances could occur without immediate detection. The village's sense of security and community, built up over generations of mutual support and shared hardship, began to crumble as residents started to view their neighbors with suspicion and mistrust. It was against this backdrop of fear and paranoia that the second disappearance occurred, an event that would finally force the villagers to confront the possibility that the threats they faced were not supernatural in nature, but rather the product of human agency operating with motives and methods that were far more sinister than any ghostly manifestation. 20-year-old Georg Weber, grandson of the elderly widow who had first reported the mysterious singing, vanished from his family's cottage on the night of December 22nd under circumstances that were virtually identical to those surrounding Anna Zimmermann's disappearance. Like Anna, Georg was discovered missing when his family attempted to wake him for his daily responsibilities, and like Anna, he had apparently left his home through a window that showed no signs of forced entry despite being securely fastened the previous evening. The footprint evidence in Georg's case provided additional details that deepened the mystery while suggesting that the disappearances were the result of careful planning rather than spontaneous events. The prints leading away from the Weber cottage were accompanied by a second set of tracks that appeared to belong to an adult, tracks that led both to and from the house and suggested that Georg had not left his home alone, but had been accompanied by someone who had approached the cottage deliberately and with specific intentions. The discovery of these additional footprints prompted Heinrich Bachmann to examine the area around Anna Zimmermann's cottage more carefully, where a fresh snowfall had previously obscured potential evidence. This re-examination revealed faint but discernible traces of adult footprints that had been present during Anna's disappearance, but had been overlooked during the initial investigation. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the village, as residents realized that their children were being targeted by individuals who were operating with systematic precision and intimate knowledge of the village's layout and routines. The systematic nature of the disappearances, combined with the mounting evidence of human involvement, prompted the villagers to reassess their suspicions about the Hartmann family's activities with a new sense of urgency and purpose. Klaus and Margaret Hartmann's increasingly secretive behavior, their apparent access to resources that were unavailable to other villagers, and their presence in the forest areas where the mysterious phenomena had been most active, now appeared in a far more sinister light. A delegation of village leaders, including Heinrich Bachmann, Father Albrecht, and Johann Zimmermann, Anna's father, approached the Hartmann cottage on the morning of December 23rd with the intention of questioning the couple about their recent activities and their possible knowledge of the disappearances. However, their plans were thwarted when they discovered that the cottage appeared to be abandoned, with no signs of recent habitation and no response to their repeated attempts to gain entry. The investigation of the abandoned Hartmann cottage revealed evidence that would fundamentally alter the villagers' understanding of the events that had plagued their community throughout the winter months. The interior of the house showed signs of hasty departure, with personal belongings scattered throughout the rooms and food preparation activities that had been interrupted mid-process. More disturbing were the discoveries made in the cottage's cellar, where the investigation team found evidence of activities that defied easy explanation or categorization. The cellar contained numerous wooden crates filled with preserved foods of varieties and quantities that would have been impossible to obtain through legitimate means during the current period of scarcity and hardship. These provisions included imported spices, candied fruits, refined sugar, and other luxury items that were rarely seen even in the homes of wealthy merchants during the best of times. The presence of such valuable commodities in the Hartmann cottage raised immediate questions about the sources of their apparent wealth and the methods they had used to acquire goods that were simply unavailable through conventional channels. More disturbing than the hoarded provisions were the personal items found among the stored goods, items that clearly belonged to individuals other than the Hartmann family. Among these discoveries were articles of clothing that matched descriptions of garments worn by Anna Zimmermann and Georg Weber on the nights of their disappearances, items that had obviously been removed from the missing persons and carefully preserved rather than discarded or destroyed. The discovery of the missing person's clothing in the Hartmann cottage prompted an intensive search of the surrounding property, including outbuildings and forest areas that the family had been observed visiting during their secretive expeditions. This expanded investigation led to the discovery of a concealed structure approximately 1 mile from the cottage, hidden within a dense grove of pine trees that provided natural camouflage and protection from casual observation. The structure, built using materials that had obviously been transported from the cottage over an extended period of time, was unlike anything the villagers had previously encountered in their region. Constructed primarily of wood and clay, it featured elaborate decorative elements that seemed designed to create a specific visual impression rather than serve any practical purpose. The exterior walls were covered with intricate patterns created from colored stones, shells, and other materials that had been embedded in the clay while it was still wet, creating a mosaic effect that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The most striking feature of the structure was its deliberate resemblance to the confections and sweets that would normally be associated with holiday celebrations and festivals. The decorative elements had been carefully chosen and arranged to create the illusion of a house made from candy, cakes, and other edible treats, complete with what appeared to be gingerbread walls, peppermint stick columns, and gumdrop ornaments that sparkled in the winter sunlight. The interior of the structure revealed the true purpose behind its elaborate and deceptive exterior design. The single room was equipped with sturdy iron restraints that had been built into the walls and floor, restraints that were clearly designed to hold human beings against their will for extended periods of time. The floor was covered with straw that showed evidence of recent use, and the walls bore scratch marks that suggested desperate attempts at escape by individuals who had been held captive within the confining space. Most horrifying of all were the remains found within the structure, remains that provided definitive proof of the fate that had befallen Anna Zimmermann, Georg Weber, and potentially other victims whose disappearances had not been reported or investigated. The physical evidence made it clear that the Hartmann couple had been using their elaborate and deceptive structure to lure victims into captivity for purposes that were too disturbing to be fully documented in official records. The discovery of the candy house and its grisly contents marked the beginning of an intensive investigation that would ultimately reveal the full scope of Klaus and Margaret Hartmann's activities and their systematic targeting of young people from Schwarzenberg and neighboring communities. Evidence found within the structure and the abandoned cottage indicated that the couple had been operating their horrific scheme for several years, using the harsh winter conditions and the village's isolation to conceal their activities from detection by authorities. The investigation revealed that the Hartmanns had developed an elaborate system for identifying and targeting potential victims, using Klaus's knowledge of the forest and Margaret's understanding of local customs and superstitions to create an environment of fear and confusion that masked their true activities. The mysterious singing that had plagued the village throughout the winter had been part of their strategy to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread that would discourage investigation while simultaneously identifying individuals who might be susceptible to their methods of enticement. The couple's apparent wealth and access to luxury goods had been acquired through the systematic robbery of their victims, who had been lured to the candy house under false pretenses before being imprisoned and murdered for their possessions. The elaborate construction and decoration of the structure served multiple purposes, both attracting potential victims with its fairy tale appearance and providing a secure location for the Hartmanns to carry out their crimes without fear of discovery or interruption. The manhunt for Klaus and Margaret Hartmann began immediately following the discovery of their crimes. But the couple had apparently anticipated the eventual exposure of their activities and had prepared for hasty departure from the region. Despite extensive efforts by local authorities and volunteer searchers, no trace of the fugitives was found in the immediate area, and it became apparent that they had fled Schwarzenberg well in advance of the investigation that would expose their horrific activities. The search for the Hartmanns expanded beyond the local region as word of their crimes spread to neighboring communities and larger towns throughout Bavaria. Descriptions of the couple and details of their methods were circulated among law enforcement officials and village leaders, but the extensive forest lands and numerous remote settlements in the region provided ample opportunities for skilled woodsmen like Klaus Hartmann to avoid detection while traveling to destinations where they might hope to resume their activities. Reports of similar disappearances and unexplained phenomena began arriving from other communities throughout the winter and spring of 1813, reports that suggested the Hartmanns might have successfully relocated and resumed their predatory activities in areas where their previous crimes were unknown to local residents. However, the scattered nature of these reports and the limited communication networks available in rural Bavaria made it impossible to verify whether they were connected to the fugitive couple or represented separate incidents that bore only coincidental resemblance to the Schwarzenberg case. The impact of the Hartmann crimes on the village of Schwarzenberg was profound and lasting, extending far beyond the immediate trauma of the murders and disappearances. The revelation that respected community members had been responsible for such horrific acts shattered the villagers' sense of security and trust in ways that would persist for generations. Families that had lived in harmony for decades began viewing each other with suspicion, and the close-knit community bonds that had sustained the village through previous hardships were permanently damaged by the knowledge that evil had been able to operate undetected in their midst. The Candy House structure became a focal point for the community's attempts to process and understand the traumatic events they had experienced. Initially, village leaders considered preserving the building as evidence or as a memorial to the victims, but the disturbing associations and memories connected with the site ultimately led to its complete destruction. The structure was dismantled and burned in a ceremony that included prayers for the souls of the victims and rituals intended to cleanse the location of the evil that had been perpetrated there. The destruction of the Candy House marked the beginning of the community's long and difficult process of healing from the trauma inflicted by the Hartmann crimes. Father Albrecht organized special religious services intended to provide comfort and guidance to the bereaved families and to help the entire community come to terms with the knowledge that such evil could exist in their world. These services were attended by representatives from neighboring villages who had come to offer support and assistance during Schwarzenberg's darkest period. The spring of 1813 brought a gradual return to normal patterns of life in Schwarzenberg, as families resumed their agricultural activities and traders began visiting the village market with increased frequency. However, the psychological scars left by the winter's events remained visible in numerous ways, from the additional security precautions that became permanent features of village life to the changes in social dynamics that reflected the community's diminished sense of trust and safety. Children who had witnessed or experienced elements of the Hartmann crimes required months of careful attention and support to overcome the trauma that had disrupted their normal development and sense of security. Parents implemented new rules and restrictions that limited their children's freedom of movement and association, creating a more controlled and supervised environment that stood in stark contrast to the traditional independence that had characterized childhood in rural Bavarian communities. The economic impact of the crimes also created lasting changes in the village's prosperity and development. The fear and uncertainty generated by the disappearances had discouraged trade and commerce during the crucial winter months, leading to shortages and hardships that persisted well into the following year. Additionally, the village's reputation for harboring such dangerous criminals made it difficult to attract new residents or businesses, slowing recovery and growth for several years after the immediate crisis had passed. Despite these challenges, the community's resilience and determination eventually enabled Schwarzenberg to overcome the worst effects of the trauma and to rebuild both its physical infrastructure and its social cohesion. The shared experience of surviving such extreme adversity created new bonds among residents and fostered a renewed commitment to vigilance and mutual protection that would characterize the village for decades to come. The official investigation into the Hartmann crimes continued for several years after the couple's initial flight from Schwarzenberg, as authorities attempted to track their movements and to identify any additional victims who might have fallen prey to their methods in other locations. However, the primitive communication and transportation systems of the early 19th century made such investigations extremely difficult, and the trail of evidence gradually grew cold as time passed and witnesses relocated or died. The case files compiled during the investigation provided detailed documentation of the Hartmanns' methods and motivations, information that would prove valuable to law enforcement officials dealing with similar crimes in other regions. The systematic nature of their approach and the elaborate deception involved in their candy house strategy represented a level of criminal sophistication that was unusual for rural areas during that historical period, making the case study valuable for understanding the evolution of predatory behavior. The final disposition of the Hartmann case remained officially unsolved, as neither Klaus nor Margarete was ever captured or conclusively identified in subsequent criminal investigations. Some reports suggested that individuals matching their descriptions had been involved in incidents in other parts of Germany and in neighboring countries. But the lack of reliable identification methods and the couple's apparent skill at avoiding detection made it impossible to verify these claims with certainty. The legend that eventually grew around the Hartmann crimes transformed the specific details of the actual events into a more generalized cautionary tale that was told and retold throughout Bavaria and beyond. Over time, the story evolved to emphasize the moral lessons that could be drawn from the tragedy, particularly the importance of vigilance against deception and the dangers posed by those who would exploit innocence and trust for evil purposes. As decades passed and the original witnesses to the events died or moved away from Schwarzenberg, the line between historical fact and folklore became increasingly blurred. The story of the candy house and its creators became integrated into the broader tradition of cautionary tales that were used to teach children about the existence of evil in the world and the importance of remaining alert to potential dangers. The village of Schwarzenberg itself gradually recovered from the trauma of 1812, eventually becoming a thriving agricultural community that attracted new residents and businesses drawn by the area's natural beauty and strategic location. However, the memory of the Hartmann crimes was preserved in local traditions and customs that continued to influence community life well into the modern era. The site where the candy house had stood was never again used for construction or agriculture, remaining instead as a small clearing within the forest that was gradually reclaimed by natural vegetation. Local custom discouraged hunting or gathering in the area, and parents continued to warn their children away from the location even after all direct memory of the crimes had faded from active community recollection. The broader implications of the Hartmann case extended beyond the immediate impact on Schwarzenberg and its residents, influencing law enforcement practices and community safety measures throughout the region. The methods used by the criminals and the extended period during which they were able to operate undetected highlighted weaknesses in the systems that rural communities used to protect themselves from predatory individuals. Village leaders throughout Bavaria began implementing new communication networks and cooperation agreements designed to share information about suspicious activities and missing persons more effectively than had been possible during the isolated winter when the Hartmanns had operated freely. These improvements in inter-community coordination represented one of the few positive outcomes to emerge from the tragic events that had devastated Schwarzenberg. The documentation and analysis of the Hartmann crimes also contributed to the development of early criminal investigation techniques that would later evolve into more sophisticated law enforcement methods. The systematic examination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral patterns established precedents that influenced how similar cases would be investigated and prosecuted in future years. The psychological insights gained from studying the Hartmanns' motivations and methods provided valuable information about the nature of predatory behavior and the factors that enable criminals to operate successfully within community settings. These insights would prove useful to future generations of law enforcement officials and community leaders dealing with similar threats to public safety. As the 19th century progressed and the original events faded into historical memory, scholars and folklorists began examining the Hartmann case as an example of how real events could be transformed into enduring cultural narratives. The evolution of the story from documented criminal case to cautionary folklore illustrated the processes by which societies preserve and transmit important moral lessons across generations. The parallels between the actual Hartmann crimes and traditional fairy tales about evil figures who lure children into danger were not coincidental, as both reflected deep-seated human anxieties about the vulnerability of innocence and the existence of malevolent forces within seemingly safe environments. The candy house itself became a powerful symbol that resonated with universal fears about deception and the exploitation of trust. The enduring power of the story to disturb and caution listeners demonstrated the effectiveness of narrative as a tool for preserving crucial safety information and moral guidance. Parents and community leaders who shared the tale with younger generations were participating in an ancient tradition of using storytelling to transmit essential knowledge about the dangers that exist in the world and the vigilance required to avoid falling victim to those who would do harm. In 1867, more than 50 years after the original crimes, a research expedition organized by the University of Munich attempted to locate and excavate the site where the Hartmann candy house had stood. The researchers hoped to find archaeological evidence that might provide additional insights into the construction techniques and materials used in creating the elaborate structure. However, the expedition encountered significant resistance from local residents who remained uncomfortable with any activities that might disturb the site or draw renewed attention to the traumatic events associated with the location. The researchers ultimately abandoned their plans out of respect for the community's wishes and in recognition of the continuing emotional impact that the historical events maintained for area residents. The failed expedition of 1867 marked the final official attempt to investigate the physical remains of the Hartmann crimes. By that time, the original site had been completely reclaimed by the forest, with no visible traces remaining of the structure that had once terrorized the village of Schwarzenberg. Local records from the period indicate that the expedition's withdrawal was met with relief by the community, which had worked for decades to move beyond the traumatic events of 1812. The villagers' resistance to renewed investigation reflected their desire to allow the victims to rest in peace and to prevent the reopening of psychological wounds that had taken generations to heal. The academic community's interest in the case continued, despite the inability to conduct physical investigations at the original site. Historians and criminologists studied the available documentation to better understand the social conditions that had enabled the Hartmans to operate undetected for such an extended period. These studies contributed to emerging theories about criminal behavior and community vulnerability that would influence law enforcement practices throughout Europe. The story of Klaus and Margaret Hartmann was eventually incorporated into academic curricula as an example of how isolated communities could become vulnerable to predatory individuals who exploited trust and traditional customs for criminal purposes. The case study was used to illustrate the importance of communication networks and coordinated law enforcement efforts in preventing similar crimes. As the 19th century drew to a close, the last surviving witnesses to the original events passed away, taking with them the final first-hand accounts of the winter that had forever changed Schwarzenberg. However, the story continued to live on through oral tradition and written records that preserved the essential details for future generations. The transformation of the Hartmann case from historical fact to cautionary legend was completed during this period, as the specific details of time and place gave way to more universal themes about the nature of evil and the importance of protecting innocence from those who would exploit it. The candy house became a symbol that transcended its original context, representing the deceptive nature of evil and the vulnerability of those who trust too readily in appearances. In 1968, exactly 156 years after the original crimes, the last official reference to the Hartmann case appeared in a police archive that was being transferred to microfilm for preservation purposes. The brief notation simply recorded the case as unsolved and recommended that the files be maintained for historical reference rather than active investigation. The microfilm containing the Hartmann case files was subsequently lost during a renovation of the archive building, effectively ending the official documentation of one of Bavaria's most disturbing criminal cases. The loss was not discovered until several years later, and by that time, the original paper records had been destroyed according to standard archival practices. Today, the village of Schwarzenberg continues to exist as a small but thriving community in the Bavarian forest, its residents largely unaware of the dark history that once defined their home. The forest paths that Klaus and Margaret Hartmann once walked remain largely unchanged, though modern safety measures and communication technologies have made it unlikely that such crimes could ever again go undetected for extended periods. The clearing where the candy house once stood has been completely reclaimed by nature, with no trace remaining of the structure that once lured innocent victims to their doom. Local hikers occasionally pass through the area without realizing they are walking over ground that once witnessed such terrible events, the forest having healed itself as communities eventually heal from even the most devastating traumas. The story endures only in the whispered tales passed down through generations, tales that serve as reminders that evil can wear beautiful disguises and that vigilance remains the price of safety in a world where not all who smile can be trusted. The candy house may be gone, but the lessons learned from its terrible legacy continue to protect those wise enough to remember that appearances can deceive and that some hungers can never be satisfied through ordinary means. And in the deepest parts of the Bavarian forest, where ancient trees cast shadows that never fully lift, and where paths wind through darkness that seems to swallow sound itself, some say that on the coldest winter nights, when the wind carries whispers through the branches, You can still hear the faint echo of singing that draws the unwary deeper into woods that remember everything and forgive nothing. The true terror of the Hartman legacy lies not in supernatural haunting, but in the knowledge that human beings proved capable of such calculated cruelty, and that somewhere in the world, others with similar appetites might still be building their own beautiful traps for the innocent and the trusting.